Now, some science on rocks. Chemical elements such as oxygen can exist with different numbers of protons and neutrons in their nuclei, so they differ in mass even though they still have the same properties. These different forms of the same element are known as isotopes. There are different types of oxygen isotope combinations in rocks depending on how close they were to the sun when they were formed or how hot it was when they were formed. So, by measuring these isotopes, we can get some idea from where these rocks originated. Think of isotopes as accents of the English language. You can often determine where a person is from with their regional accent, or similarly from International English, American, Australian, Indian, Chinese, and so on. When moon rocks are compared with rocks on Earth, we find the same isotope combinations, indicating that moon rocks did probably start on the Earth prior to the Earth's collision with the planet Theia. Don't worry, the collision was a while ago. Any such Earth-lying meteorites will have been altered on their super-hot journey through the Earth's atmosphere. As such, their outer surface is likely to have been burnt to form a crust. These moon rocks will also have solar and cosmic radiation damage not found in rocks on Earth, as the Earth is well protected by the magnetosphere. The question is, can this radiation signature be falsified here on Earth, and the evidence of entry through the Earth's atmosphere be disguised? Is it possible for NASA to have faked the moon rocks by altering the Antarctic rocks collected by Wernher von Braun's field trip? The skeptics would argue that the answer is yes, and that is exactly what they did. We will let Skeptic Hunchback describe what this business is all about. In this video, he mentions the visit of Wernher von Braun to Antarctica 2 years before the Apollo 11 missions to the moon. He then explains what the likely basic difference is between moon rocks and lunar meteorites found on Earth, as we mentioned above. First of all, any moon rocks entering the Earth's atmosphere would have burnt crust. Secondly, the moon rocks on the moon would have been bombarded by micrometeorites and will have a telltale zap craters, tiny holes that the micrometeorites had struck. He maintains that NASA moon rocks could have been faked from Earth-lying lunar meteorites by removing the burnt crust and adding false zap craters using lasers. So according to Skeptic Hunchback, it would have been entirely possible for NASA to have faked the moon rocks from Earth-lying lunar meteorites. Unfortunately, he also goes on to mention the so-called fake Netherland moon rock and mistakenly uses this as some proof that there are fake moon rocks. This Netherlands fake moon rock story has been highlighted by almost every skeptic as proof that NASA faked moon rocks, but we shall discover the truth behind this fake rock later in this video. Wernher von Braun in Antarctica. The skeptics often point to the fact that in the Antarctic local summer from 1966 to 1967, Wernher von Braun, the chief architect at NASA, participated in a U.S. government expedition to Antarctica. This expedition was one of the first to systematically search for the ice surface of Antarctica for meteorites believed to have originated from the moon. The U.S. government claimed that these samples were for later use as a reference material. This leads to the obvious question by the skeptics: if Wernher von Braun was so feverishly working to get the Saturn V rocket up and running to very tight schedules, then why did he take the time to go rock hunting in Antarctica? Perhaps he just needed a stress break, and who wouldn't want a free trip to Antarctica if they had the opportunity? There are numerous videos concerning moon rocks on the internet, so much so that it is hard to select which ones best convey the subject. I have need to be very selective in order to properly explain the debate. The skeptic's story is that the Apollo moon rocks were not brought back from the moon, but were simply collected here on Earth and then altered to resemble moon rocks. The problem is, how can these two types of moon rocks be identified and distinguished one from the other? Remember, at the time of Apollo 11, nobody really knew how moon rocks would differ from lunar meteorites. Anything that the scientists did know was based on scientific conjecture. A lot of debate on the question of moon rocks takes place between believer Phil Webb and skeptic Gerald White. At times, this confrontation can be very antagonistic, which does not help the viewer. We will start with a video by Gerald White, which sums up the basis of the story. This video provides an idea of the anonymity that exists between our two protagonists. Unfortunately, Jera needs to get into the complex subject of geology to show the similarities between moon rocks and Earth-lying meteorites. Unfortunately, much of the remainder of the video is related to the discussion between our two chief protagonists. By the way, just for the record, Jera White is a geologist. Phil Webb contends that meteorites can easily be distinguished from NASA's moon rocks by their mineralogy, bulk chemical composition, and oxygen isotope ratios. He goes on to describe how different the moon rocks here on Earth rocks by comparing their chemical compositions. He does, however, state that there is no certainty where a meteorite came from, although scientists can estimate the source with a high degree of probability. He does say, however, that it is possible for scientists to distinguish the moon rocks from other meteorites and Earth rocks. Webb concludes by saying that Jera White has offered no convincing evidence that the moon rocks are fake. Skeptic Jera White thinks he knows how NASA could have created the zap pits and the fake moon rocks. We could go on and show you many more videos, but they are extremely complex and difficult to understand unless you are a space geologist. If you are inclined to see more moon rocks, then simply look on YouTube for NASA moon rocks. You may even find some for sale. The Goodwill Rocks. U.S. President Richard Nixon ordered 2 distributions of moon rocks collected from the Apollo missions as a goodwill gesture to world nations. The first was in 1969 when he ordered the distribution of tiny pieces of moon rock fragment collected by the Apollo 11 astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to foreign heads of state all over the world. Each rock was encased in an acrylic button and was mounted on a wooden plaque with the intended recipient's flag, which had also been flown to the moon. All of these plaques were of the same design as seen in the U.S. state of Illinois' plaque. The second was 3 months after the Apollo 17 mission returned home in December 1972, when U.S. President Richard Nixon again ordered the distribution of tiny fragments taken from the rock that Cernan and Schmidt had collected to 135 foreign heads of state and the 50 U.S. states. The design of this plaque was significantly different to the 1969 version. It had 2 metal plates reading, "The fragment is a portion of a rock from the Taurus Littoral Valley of the Moon. It is given as a symbol of the unity of human endeavor and carries with it the hope of the American people for a world at peace." And, "This flag of your nation was carried to the moon on board spacecraft America during the Apollo 17 mission, December 7th to 19th, 1972, presented to the people of the state of, from the people of the United States of America, Richard Nixon, 1973. A letter signed by President Nixon accompanied each sample when transferred to foreign heads of state. Dated March 21, 1973, it reads as follows, as reproduced from the U.S. National Archives. The Apollo lunar landing program conducted by the United States has been brought to a successful conclusion. Men from the planet Earth have reached the first milestone in space. But as we stretch for the stars, we know that we stand also upon the shoulders of many men and many nations here on our own planet. In the deepest sense of our exploration of the moon was truly an international effort. It is for this reason that, on behalf of the people of the United States, I present this flag which was carried to the moon, to the state, and its fragment of the moon obtained during the final lunar mission of the Apollo program. If people of many nations can act together to achieve the dreams of humanity in space, then surely we can act together to accomplish humanity's dream of peace here on Earth. It was in this spirit that the United States of America went to the moon, and it is this spirit that we look forward to sharing what we have done and what we have learned with all mankind. According to this Wikipedia article, many of the Goodwill rocks cannot be traced. Note that all of these Goodwill moon rocks were tiny fragments of moon rock totally encased in an acrylic button, so not capable of being analyzed. Note also that there is no record of NASA ever giving any nation a moon rock of any size, and certainly no moon rock in the raw. These moon rocks were far too valuable to distribute until much later, and then only for scientific purposes. The Netherlands Fake Moon Rock Mystery. Shortly after the successful Apollo 11 moon landings, the 3 triumphant Apollo 11 astronauts, together with their wives, embarked on a goodwill tour of 20 countries. They visited the Netherlands, and it was subsequently reported that they presented the former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Wil Dries, with a sample of moon rock. The rock was subsequently displayed in the Dutch Rijks bearing the proud inscription, Amsterdam Rijksmuseum rock presented by Apollo 11 astronauts on visit October 9, 1969 to PM William Dries, with the compliments of the Ambassador of the United States of America, J. William Mindendorf II. To commemorate the visit of the Netherlands of the Apollo 11 astronauts Neil A. Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Edward E. Aldrin, Jr. RAI International Exhibition and Congress Center, Amsterdam, October 9, 1969. The story goes like this. Following the death of Wilhelm Dries in 1988, his estate presented what they believed to be a moon rock of the Dutch Rijksmuseum, which was exhibited for more than a decade. In 2009, it was examined in detail and subjected to rigorous testing and found to be a piece of petrified wood, most likely from Arizona. The rock had been valued at 308,000 sterling, but it is now kept for the museum as a mere curiosity. This story was reported in the UK newspaper The Telegraph and various other newspapers around the world, and, as you can imagine, was quickly jumped on by the skeptics as further evidence that something had been concealed by NASA. Within days, skeptics were posting information, gleefully reporting this story and announcing that it confirms the moon hoax by NASA. It is hard to contemplate how this could have happened. The moon rocks were apparently securely guarded by NASA, mainly to limit contamination in Earth's atmosphere. For the skeptics, this is just another anomaly that needs to be explained. Like everything else in our adventure story, it may not be as clear-cut as was reported. You may find the story rather strange, particularly when you look at the inscription on the original card found by Dries' family. With the compliments of the Ambassador of the United States of America, J. William Mindendorf II, to commemorate the visit to the Netherlands of the Apollo 11 astronauts Neil A. Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Edward E. Aldrin, Jr. RAI International Exhibition of Congress Center, Amsterdam, October 9, 1969. The Dries family also found what appeared to be a rock and just made the reasonable assumption that the card and rock were related. Thinking it was an important moon rock, they generally offered it to the Dutch Rijksmuseum. The museum did contact NASA to check its authenticity and to ascertain whether NASA could verify that this was a real rock from the moon. They received a less than satisfactory answer, only that it could be possible. No doubt the respondent at NASA didn't take trouble to carefully check out the archives as to what happened 40 years ago, and thus gave the possible answer, which was accepted by the museum. The museum then added the caption to the moon rock display, Amsterdam Rijksmuseum, moon rock presented by Apollo 11 astronauts on visit October 9, 1969 to PM William Dries, and put the rock proudly on display. So, looking at the original card, sure, the date is correct. The astronauts did visit the Netherlands on 9th October 1969 for a few hours, and they did visit the exhibition entitled Voyage to the Moon at the RAI Exhibition Center. The problem is that the inscription on the original card does not mention what the actual gift was or to whom the gift was made, only to who it was from. One would expect it to mention that this is a moon rock and the presumably important recipient of the rock. It seems rather unlikely that just a few months after the successful landing on the moon that NASA would be distributing a large piece, 3.1 ounces, one of only 50 pieces of moon rock brought back from Apollo 11 to just one of the 10 still surviving former Dutch prime ministers. You may ask, why just him? It is not as though he was even the current prime minister. The truth is that the inscribed card and the supposed moon rock were found separately by the family of William Dries in his possession after his death, and they incorrectly, but without any devious intent, associated two items together. They thought that they had discovered some important national treasure and graciously donated the card together with the moon rock to the Rijksmuseum. NASA now state that no moon rocks were distributed to anyone before that date, as they were still in the progress of being catalogued. However, that was given to many dignitaries of the Goodwill mission tour were the Apollo 11 photographs autographed by the 3 astronauts, so the card could relate to one of these. But let's have the true believer Phil Webb give the full details of this strange story in his 2-part YouTube video. We mentioned above that President Richard Nixon did send a real moon rock to the Netherlands, as he did to many countries, just 4 minuscule pieces encased in lucite perspex button. But this was always held in the Museum Boerhaave, located in Leiden, together with 2 Netherlands flags which the astronauts had taken to the moon on Apollo 11 and Apollo 17. These items have not been on display for many years, but are now held in the museum's basement store. Like most of us, the Dutch lost interest in these artifacts. Even though the explanation given above is totally valid and can be verified with the museum, we still find some skeptics endlessly repeating this fake moon rock story. We don't know for certain whether there are any fake moon rocks. There could well be, but what we can confidently conclude is that the reported Netherlands fake moon rock is definitely not one of them.
I do feel it gone, but not know where it went.
William Shakespeare, The Winter's Tale.
This chapter is not specifically related to evidence as to whether NASA landed men on the moon or not, although it may throw some light on the subject. It chronicles the lamentable custodianship shown by NASA of important historical artifacts concerning the Apollo missions and the total disregard for managing technological value. This is particularly surprising given NASA's relatively recent 2011 announcement that it has an anxious desire to protect the Apollo artifacts that remain on the moon, as we shall see in a future video in this series. No doubt our skeptics would argue that it is not a question of good custodianship, but more a deliberate and concentrated attempt to destroy evidence that may be judged to be incriminating when examined with modern methods of analysis. Certainly, the losses of artifacts is almost epic in scale, and one has to question why NASA has been so determinedly careless. The Apollo landings have been heralded as one of the greatest achievements of mankind, and one would expect that all of the documentation and technological achievements would be carefully preserved for posterity. Regrettably, and quite surprisingly, this does not seem to have been the case. It would appear that NASA have been less than conscientious in preserving these important artifacts. This is astonishing for 2 reasons. First and foremost, the historical nature of the achievement in this modern era. We tend to hold as precious everything that measures the progress and achievements of mankind. Secondly, the information is undoubtedly of considerable usefulness. Now, NASA plans to go back into outer space with the Orion project and appears to be struggling to build the technology with to do this. Skeptics would strongly argue, and they do quite vociferously, that we supposedly had the technology to leave low Earth orbit and survive in space 50 years ago. They question how NASA could have been so utterly careless, or are there other impelling reasons for this perceived ineptitude? The suspicion is there for the skeptics to add to their arguments that NASA faked the moon landings and is now trying to destroy anything that could ultimately prove the fakery when examined with modern methods of analysis. Telemetry and video data.
One of the most important aspects of the journey to the moon was the telemetry data. This is the automated communication process by which measurements and other data are collected at remote or inaccessible points and transmitted to receiving equipment for monitoring. It was an essential part of the mission to the moon and would be of significant importance for future journeys into outer space. You may think that the telemetry is not something that concerns you, but if you were using a computer running Microsoft or Mac software, or using Google for your searches, which you most probably are, then you are daily involved in telemetry. These organizations collect telemetry data on what you do every second of the day, and there is little you can do about it. In the UK, and also in many other developed countries, when you drive around town or down a motorway, information on your movements is collected via your car registration number. This is telemetry, and again, there is little you can do about it. Even when you walk along the street or go shopping, your movements are being recorded by a vast network of surveillance cameras.
It is just a fact of modern life that we need to accept.
Lost information.
On August 2006, the Sydney Morning Herald reported that NASA had lost the original telemetry tapes of the Apollo 11 moon landing, which also included perhaps the most legendary small step for man, giant leap for mankind footage. These original magnetic tapes that recorded the iconic images of man's first footsteps on the moon are missing, and scientists fear that there is a danger of these tapes deteriorating into dust unless they are found quickly and converted into digital format. The skeptics are quick to coin the phrase, "one small mistake by NASA, one giant loss for mankind." In 2006, NASA also stated that the search is on to find the boxes of original, high-quality, slow-scan TV tapes. The tapes were stored in 2,612 large boxes, each box holding about 50 telemetry tapes. These lost boxes apparently held the telemetry data tapes and also contained the original TV footage of the other 5 moon landings. Estimates of the number of tapes vary between 130,000 to 140,000, of which about 13,000 of these tapes related to the Apollo missions. These are not small tapes, as in the main they consisted of 14-inch diameter reels of mostly 1 and some 2-inch wide magnetic tape. The tape recorder reader consumed a whopping 120 inches of tape every second, an astonishing speed of almost 7 miles per hour. So we are not talking about losing a bunch of keys or the odd book. We're talking about losing 2,612 large boxes. The skeptics say that we are not simply looking for a few tapes, but the whole building. In fact, it is a pile of about 11,000 cubic feet. Is that hard to visualize? Well, a modern 3-bedroom house in the UK is about 7,500 square feet. It was quite a challenge to lose 2 3-bedroom houses, the skeptics would say, even by NASA standards. The flight director of the Apollo missions, Gene Kranz, acknowledges when interviewed by Aaron Rainan that the data tapes are indeed lost. Kranz further states that even if these tapes could be found, there is no machine that could read the tapes, as the only machines capable of reading these tapes was destroyed many years ago. The skeptics say that NASA is hell-bent on destroying everything related to the Apollo missions except the glory. Finally, NASA researchers concluded that the tapes containing the raw unprocessed Apollo 11 SSTV signals were erased and reused by NASA in the early 1980s, unbelievably due to a shortage of magnetic tape at the time in NASA. It transpires that NASA's usage of the 1-inch magnetic tapes amounted to 60 per day in 1981, which far outstripped the quantity available at the time. What did NASA have to say about this? Well, not much, to be honest, if you read their statement on this matter. NASA initially stated that they do not consider the tapes to be lost, just mislaid, and the search continues, but shortly afterwards, they admitted that the tapes were indeed lost. Well, not so much lost, but wiped clean and reused. This loss is confirmed in the final report from the NASA searchers. Is it any wonder that the skeptics find this story so utterly convincing? These recordings were some of the most significant documentation of man's greatest achievement to explore the universe beyond our Earth, and for them to be so carelessly guarded is mystifying. The skeptics reason that NASA may have had something to hide and didn't want these tapes to be scrutinized by modern methods of analysis. We shall never know the answer, as the evidence seemingly is long gone.
NASA not only carelessly loses tapes, but also photographs. In the period 1966 to 1967, NASA had the lunar orbiter taking many detailed photographs of the moon in preparation for the Apollo missions, basically in order to identify suitable landing sites. Most of these photographs were also assumed lost. Luckily, some of these original photographs were found by a group of amateurs who extracted about 2,000 photographs from 1,500 old NASA analog tapes. Suffice it is to say that NASA has not been the best custodian of this historical material. It is hard to reason why, with such a large budget, these important artifacts were not more zealously guarded. After all, these artifacts were similarly as important to the American historical record as the American Declaration of Independence, which thankfully they still have managed to keep intact for 250 years. Lost technology. NASA was not only haphazard in its custodianship of its data tapes and photographs, but also of its technical design documents and manufacturing capabilities. The billions of dollars that were invested in the NASA Apollo space project did produce much useful technological value of benefit not only for future space exploration projects, but also for industry in general. The Apollo missions were made possible by the creation of the massive Saturn V rocket, which provided the heavy lift necessary to get astronauts all the way to the moon. You might consider that this was something worth keeping, given NASA's sole raison d'etre is to explore space. Well, it may surprise you to learn that they didn't, and the methodology and plans required to build this rocket have been lost. It is not only the plans and the design documents that have gone missing, but also the factory tooling was also scrapped. NASA now again needs a heavy lift vehicle for its Orion program and is once again having to re-engineer what NASA already had 50 years ago. The new heavy lift rocket for the Orion project has been named the Space Launch System SLS for lack of a better name. There are 3 remaining Saturn V rockets in museums that could possibly be reverse engineered, but how much easier would it have been just to follow the original plans? Actually, anybody familiar with the IKEA furniture assembly plans may doubt this. Now, when we say that NASA lost the ability to recreate the technology that they had for the Apollo missions, it doesn't of course mean that they could have not created it again, but that would be very much like reinventing the wheel. What it does mean is that NASA is not even capable of even getting astronauts to the International Space Station without taking a Russian taxi at US $70 million per seat round trip. The excuse by NASA for this lack of housekeeping is that the Apollo project was spread out among thousands of subcontractors and that it was impossible to keep track of every document, but quite honestly, this is a tantalizingly feeble excuse. You can be sure that Airbus Industries keeps a very comprehensive set of documents in some central location, and certainly at some point NASA must have also had a complete set of documentation. The lunar rover, which was used on Apollo missions 15, 16, and 17, was built by Boeing, and again, you guessed it, the design plans have been destroyed. If taking care of important artifacts is the object, then NASA fails miserably. In 2015, a priceless prototype of the lunar rover was sold for scrap to a metal dealer in Alabama. This was one of the earliest prototypes for the lunar rover and therefore had great historical significance, but somehow it wasn't cared for and ended up in the Alabama scrap metal yard. There is even a photograph of the NASA Apollo director Wernher von Braun driving this very vehicle. We are not finished with the scrap yards just yet, we have more. In 1976, 10 years after the Apollo launch, the rope memory modules were also sold as scrap metal. Someone with a keen eye spotted them in a scrap metal auction and saved them for posterity. This video shows how the programs on these modules are now being deciphered. There is a great interest in the computing industry to see how these programs worked. We also saw in an earlier video that NASA were selling off Apollo technology by the tonload. NASA are not only careless with valuable technology and historical artifacts, but also it appears that they are lax in their security. Surprisingly, for such an organization, they do not encrypt the data on their laptops, and recently they have had 2 stolen, perhaps another sign that they are not quite on the ball. In October 2016, 47 years after the original moon landing, NASA finally produced a white paper on science data retention. This paper addressed which NASA science data should be retained indefinitely and the conditions under which certain data may and should be released. Talk about closing the gate after the horses have bolted. Only make-believe! We will draw the curtain and show you the picture. William Shakespeare, Twelfth Night. This portion is a departure from the rest of the video series in that it focuses on one particular skeptic's YouTube video submission entitled Make Believe, Smoke and Mirrors. In that respect, it is totally biased and completely one-sided. I discovered this video quite by accident in my usual searching activities on the internet.
Remember, with well over 11 million hits for the Google search phrase "site moon hoax," then there are undoubtedly many videos which I have not yet been discovered. The video, which was posted anonymously, purports to explain in considerable detail exactly how NASA, and presumably elements of the US government, faked the Apollo moon landings. Henceforth, we shall refer to our anonymous benefactor and narrator as Mr. X. If, as the skeptics vociferously claim, NASA's Apollo astronauts never actually set foot on the moon, then how did NASA manage to produce the evidence that fooled the world and still does the majority of people to this day? We need to remind ourselves that we are back in the 1960s, long before computers with any real processing power, or digital photographs, or computer-generated images, CGI, were available, so fooling the world's population with videos from the moon must have represented quite a daunting challenge for NASA. Some may say that it was more difficult than actually going to the moon, but perhaps going to the moon was not a feasible alternative for NASA. Nowadays, it would be relatively easy with powerful computers and digital images to fake any journey into space, but on the other hand, we have more powerful fake detection possibilities too.
A vacuum is not empty. It may sound like magic to lay people, but the problem has preoccupied physicists since the birth of quantum mechanics. The apparent void of bubbles incessantly and produces fluctuations of light even at absolute zero temperature. In a sense, these virtual photons are just waiting to be used. They can carry forces and change the property of matter. The force of a vacuum, for instance, is known to produce the Casimir effect. When one moves two parallel metallic plates of a capacitor very close together, they feel a microscopically small but measurable attraction between each other, even if the plates are not electrically charged. This attraction is created by the exchange of virtual photons between the plates, like two ice skaters who throw a ball back and forth and are subjected to the recoil. If the ball was visible, one would assume that a repellent force acts between them. Now, the MPSD team of Michael Stantef, Michael Rugenthaler, and Angel Rubio has published a study in Science Advances which draws a connection between the force of a vacuum and the most modern materials. In particular, they explore the question of what happens if the two-dimensional high-temperature superconductor ion selenide on a substrate of SRTiO3 is located in the gap between two metallic plates where virtual photons fly back and forth. This is the outcome of their theories and simulations. The force of the vacuum makes it possible to couple the fast electrons in the 2D layer more strongly to the lattice vibrations of the substrate, which swing perpendicular to the 2D layer. The coupling of superconducting electrons and the vibrations of the crystal lattice is a central building block for important properties of many materials. So much for a vacuum not producing a force. We are only beginning to understand these processes, says Michael Stantef. For example, we do not precisely know how strong the influence of the vacuum light would realistically be on the oscillations of the surface. We are talking about quasi-particles of light and phonons, so-called phonon polaritons. Phonon polaritons were measured with lasers decades ago. However, this is new scientific territory where complex new 2D quantum materials are concerned. Of course, we hope that our work prompts the experimental colleagues to test our predictions. MPSD theory director Angel Rubio is delighted about these new possibilities. The theories and numerical simulations in our department are a key element in a whole new generation of potential technological developments. Even more importantly, it will encourage researchers to reconsider the old problem associated with interaction between light and the structure of matter. Rubio is highly optimistic regarding the role of fundamental research in this area. Together with the experimental progress, for example, in the controlled production and precise measurement of atomic structures and their electronic properties, we can look forward to great discoveries. In his view, scientists are about to embark on a new era of atomic design of the fluctuations in chemical compounds, particularly in 2D materials and complex molecules. Rubio is convinced the force of the vacuum will help us in this quest. So much for what Jinskin Pivot has to say about the state of vacuum. Now, speaking of vacuum, let's refer to figure 1 above. As we can see, this mylar, which is the same material that is used on the LEM, is completely destroyed in a vacuum test
of 10 torr to the minus 6. These tests were conducted at the Sandusky vacuum chamber. Note that film and mylar are made of the same material, so how could the film used in the Hasselblad cameras on the supposed moon have survived at torr 10 to the minus 12 as found on the lunar surface? As we look at figure 2 above, we can see that cellulose acetate and allyl diglycol carbonate completely disintegrate at the torr level of 10 to the minus 6. Once again, it makes you wonder how film or mylar material can survive on the lunar surface at a vacuum level of torr 10 to the minus 11. It would appear for certain that these elements cannot survive in the vacuum found in deep space.